Good morning, Church History 2. This is Dr. Mary Butler, and this is the lecture for part 6. Our lecture, part 6, The Church in America. And so I just want to get this lecture to you so that I pray that you have already read the material. But at any rate, here we go. I'll try to be as brief as I can. And just to hit a few high points in this, I believe this would be chapter 25. And so it is, if your book has a page, um, it would be about page 125. This is an era of settlement. And this talks about the Christian history, our background, and it gives a little bit of it helps us to understand the history of the church a little better as it is up to this point. I'm going to put the document on the board, the chapter on the board, part 6, the Church in America, chapter 25, an era of settlement. I pray that you are able to see the screen, you're able to see the board. And to hit a few high points, we come in, we see the Spanish. When you read this, you're really looking at high points so that you can understand. If you could pick up the high points of your book, any book, and you would get a real understanding of it. Highlight those high points. And so we see the Spanish, again, an era of settlement. We're talking about the church in America or in North America or the church in America. And we see Spain because what we're saying is different ones were coming in and colonizing this part of the world. Spain, it says when Columbus sailed westward in 1492, he was not merely looking for a new route to the Indies, he hoped to discover new sources of wealth to finance another crusade against the Muslims. Now, we know that that's how things get done. People go out in search of wealth and riches, but at the same time, they are taking with them their religion. And this is the way of Spain. Spain went into uncharted parts of the world, and wherever they went, they took their religion with them. And in this case, um, of course, Spain took that part of them that was the Roman Church. And so we will see many Spanish missions in the in this part of the world of Mexico and in some of the Spanish settlements of Santo Domingo, Cuba, in Latin America, and on into, we know they came on into what is now called Florida. We know that they came all into that. So we hit the highlights. And if you highlight right at that second paragraph where it says, when one recalls that the Spanish usually sent their sons back to Europe for education, it would be clear that these New World institutions were especially for the training of the natives. So when they came to dominate or to um, bring their religion to the native people. So we want to understand that. As far as one of the things that they did was send their young men to Europe for education. That's what people did in those days. And so we see that even today we see some of the third world countries like Africa, and they will send their those ones that are wealthy in those third world countries will send their children, even in Africa, they send their children to be educated in England or in France. And so we see that even happening today. So we saw in that paragraph where it says, admittedly, that third paragraph, it says that Portuguese settlements in Brazil began in 1532. And of course, the Roman Church was established there. We see that. So, um, again, we just hit highlights and like, how did the Spanish get here? And again, remember, we're talking about the 17th century, the 17th century. And that's how things happen with explorers. You know, we have the explorers. Well, what about the French? The French uh, did the same thing. They came in and they established territories or colonies, and um, the French did not get a hold as as maybe the Spanish, but they did in Quebec. That's why when you go to Canada, even today, you'll see some of Canada is speaking French. So they leave their mark and they leave their religion. That's all the author is trying to tell us about the French. They set up mission stations, trading ports, posts, and forts whenever they penetrated. So wherever they went, they left a mark. Even as the French went into um, Louisiana, we know that some of that is still there. And so, but it did not become permanent where all of America now would be speaking French, you know. But then we have the English. The English came also, and they did the same thing, colonize and establish themselves. And so that's where we are in this part of the world. And we talk about in Jamestown, 1607, the English established their first successful colony. I believe they had attempted to do this on many occasions, and but they really established their first successful colony planted by the Virginia Company. Um, we see that um, we know about the Pilgrims. They were persecuted in England because of their religious view, and many of them took refuge in Holland. And finally, they made arrangements with the London Company to settle in Virginia. So that's how they got here. Um, and so just read the highlights. Decades later, the Massachusetts Bay Company, with its charter, stockholders and board of directors, we know about that part of this. We learned this. I did. I learned this in when I was in high school about the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Mayflower, the Pilgrims. We learn about all these things, how these things got started, and how we are established, even the Pilgrims. And but you know, one of the things that we don't always learn about is that Black people were even before they were enslaved. We always had Black explorers, even Black explorers and people that were on ships and so forth. We don't always see that history that it's there. And so meanwhile, primarily because of economic advantage, sellers of a congregational conviction spilled over into Connecticut. As we see the progression, we see how these people settled. Some settled in Virginia, New England, Maryland, Delaware. And we see that part. We also see that some of the great schools that we have, we call the Ivy League schools, like Harvard and Yale. These were religious institutions, religious schools established by the Puritans or some of the Congregationalist church that came in from England. These schools were started, well, back in the 1636 and 1701, Harvard and Yale. We see that. So we're just hitting the highlights. I can't tell it all. But I always ask myself, where are the enslaved people? Because I know we're there. And so they're planting colonies in Maryland, Baltimore, um, and and it seems that Baltimore was more or less, we see a lot of Roman Catholics there, and that's how things happen. Immigrants bring their religion. We see that even today, how immigrants bring their religion with them. You know, the Germans and the Dutch, the same thing. People leave their countries for a reason, and so they come to these new colonies. The Germans and the Dutch, um, because they were persecuted in both England and New England. What better place to come than to come to a place such as America, which is um, this northern part of the world. And so they come here and they're able to establish themselves. And then we come down to that second paragraph where it says, and looking again at the Germans and the Dutch, in 1623, New Amsterdam was founded on Manhattan Island. New Amsterdam, Manhattan Island, Manhattan. That's New York, folks. That's New York. That's how New York gets its name. So New Amsterdam became New York, and that's how that New York was established. So when these immigrants came, they brought their religion, they brought the ways that they do things and everything. Again, they are escaping something. They are trying to come out of something, and we see how we all got here. They came looking for wealth and looking for religious expression and so forth. But how did we get here? The majority of us, most of us, we got here because of slavery. We had a continent, Africa, you know, but we didn't leave our home because we wanted to leave our country. We were brought here against our will. We see the Puritans. Also, read the Puritans. You need to know a little bit about them. You just familiarize yourself. Um, it says but one 17th century group often referred to and almost as commonly misrepresented and vilified are the Puritans. We talk about the Puritans in school and in our literature. We don't know that much about them. We just take it the Puritans and we leave it at that. So what the author is trying to say is that we really need to study this group. It says the author says the goal here is not to defend them or even to explain them in any detail. Certainly, it is impossible to provide in a definitive statement when many library shelves are filled with books about them. There's much information about the Puritans. However, we always see the Puritans at maybe Halloween or Thanksgiving, something like that, and that's about it. But they made a great contribution, as all of them did. And then the author points out theologically, right here, theologically, economically, and he goes on down to show that theologically, socially, economically, and that they made a contribution. And they were ones that they didn't believe in spending a lot of money or wasting a lot of things, as we would say today. And they did not commonly wear dark clothes as we always see them. We always see them and we think, well, that's the Puritans. They just wear those little square shoes or whatever. You know, we just need to know more about them and the contribution they made theologically, socially, and economically to what we are as a country. And then this was a God fearing people also. So uh, they opposed the celebration of Christmas um, and other things. So there's a lot of things that we need to know about them. They had a lot of social controls and so forth like that. And then as we move on, we go into the 18th century. That's chapter 26, breaking of ties and revival. By the time we get to the 18th century, the 18th century wants to get away from um, those countries that they came out of or those religious institutions that they came out of. And so they want to break some ties and they begin to have revival and we will see that. So as we look at it, the development of the colonies south of Virginia occurred largely in the 18th century. So when we really see the development begin, it's in the 18th century. And it says, in fact, settlement in Georgia did not even begin until 1733. So we see all these places in the 17th century. These places were rural. They were not built up. So, but by the 18th century, there's establishment. Even churches are beginning to have a mark, you know. But we have the Anglican Church that always had such an influence. But that's the thing now. People want to break away from the Anglican Church, which represented England, which that was what they were trying to get away from, is that church, because that church seemed to have dominated. In general, second paragraph here, in general, it may be said that at the time of the American Revolution, the Anglican Church dominated the southern colonies and the Congregational Church, the northern colonies. What does this mean? It means that by the time of the American Revolution was that revolution that this country or these people wanted to get away from England. So there's a revolution, there's a war. And so how do you, if you are a member of the Anglican Church, which is Church of England, how do you fight a battle here? And so it caused a lot of, in fact, I believe the church, the Congregational Church, lost a lot of its members. In the United States, complete separation of church and state was achieved in most states, because if you know anything about the Congregational Church in England, you know that the Church of England is the Queen's Church. It is the Church of England. And so in America, or in these colonies at the time, bringing in the American Revolution is to disestablishment of the church, so that you don't have this hold over you, you know. And many hated to let go of because that's where you came out of, the Congregational Church, the Church of England. You want to be loyal to that, but now you are here. And you know, once you get over here, it's like you don't think that you have to belong to the Queen or be loyal to the Queen or the King in this case. So one of the notes that it has here in about the, about the third paragraph, we're looking at the 18th century, breaking ties. And about that third paragraph, it says, where it says, it is remarkable that although in the rest of the Western world before, during, and after the American Revolutions, a state church was everywhere established. Even in Spain, we know the church is the Catholic Church. Every place had an established church. That church was ran by the state. It had something to do with the state, you know. But here in America, that had not occurred. And we see that. Now, it says here, an established church is one officially maintained by a government and supported by taxes levied on all citizens. The degree of toleration according to minority faith varies from place to place. So there was always that dominant church that was supported by whatever the government. So as in England, the Congregational Church, that's the Queen Church. She's one of her things, is oath, is to be loyal to that church. Okay, and even the parliament, you know. So we have something about called disestablishment of churches. So there's a movement. There are several reasons for the disestablishment of the church in the United States, so that there is no establishment of a state church. And there are several reasons for that. So if I were to ask you what are those reasons, I'm just going to give you those reasons from the book. And it says, first, looking where it says establishment of the church. Let me see if we can get on the same page. First, y'all see that? First, you see that? That one, there are several reasons. First, the kind and extent of immigration that flowed into the colonies after 1690 was significant. You get people immigrating from all over the place, and they're bringing all different religions. So it's kind of hard to establish one central church. Then we go to number two for a second. When we go to second, and I'm going to try to come down to the second thing here, a second influence that we're looking for. A second influence. A second influence, because what we were trying to say, what we're looking for, it says several reasons for the disestablishment of the church in the United States. So the second thing was, or influence is, for disestablishment, was the effect of the proprietary colonies. Many colonies, proprietary means those churches, those colonies were settled by, say, England, or France settled that. Those are proprietary. They supported those colonies, you know. So the influence favoring disestablishment was the effect of proprietary colonies. When you have been in a war, an American Revolution, and you have colonies that are faithful to England, you know, people are not going to really want to support that. They don't want to support that, nor the religion of that. So we see that is the second influence. That's the second thing. Third, we come down to third here. Here's third. We see it at the bottom of the page. The level and influence of the great revivals that shook the colonies during the 18th century made their impact. Something happened. There was such an outpouring or religious fervor. Something happened with the revivals, and people just didn't want to have an established church, such as the Church of England or the Catholic Church in some countries. That was the state religion. And so we see that fervor of the revivals that shook the colonies. Okay. And fourth, we come down to fourth, and it says fourth, pioneering attitudes made a contribution similar to that of the revival. The frontier was a leveler. It was a leveling place. And when you get out there on the frontier, or you get out someplace that's unknown and you're doing okay, you're like, who needs religion? Who needs the Church of England? Who needs that? You know, and then too, the church is not able to always get to you, and so then they lose their grip. Also, you're way out somewhere on the frontier. Fifth, the impact of the unchurched was significant. There were so many people, and I think I just said that, because the frontier moved up so fast and people were spread out in such a thin line, the churches failed to keep up with the needs of the population. So these are some reasons that we do not have an established church. And then we go to six, because there's a sixth one. I believe there is a sixth one. Let me see. We talked about the fourth one, the pioneering attitude. Okay, the fifth one, we talked about the fifth one. There is a sixth one. Natural rights philosophy influenced many. Something that I think the author may have talked about is natural rights philosophy. It had to do with, like I said, many of the revivals raising up, many people, many different thoughts, philosophy, and the rise of deism. We see these things rising up. Atheism, we see atheism even rising up in the 18th century. We see that. It's a new thought, and some of these things come from France. A lot of this came from France. A lot of it came from over that way, and we see a lot of that. So then we want to go to the last thing we want to say about this, if you were looking for this, the last thing we would want to say is last. So we have six, and then it says last. agitation for the appointment of an Anglican bishop in America. There was a time when people were trying to get started the church as the Church of England, maybe get the Anglican Church here in America. And that just didn't go. That just didn't go. Um, because the frontier, because no, of so many people being out there unreachable and so forth. So we see that um, the gospel fires and the revival and so forth, that just would not happen. So um, then you see that little blurb there that says, if Parliament, you see that. Let me see if we see that. Um, because my book is sometimes a little bit okay. Uh okay. What I was trying to say was, let me see. Hold on a minute, right here, right here. Um, we have, and I don't want to lose the place. Okay, but cries of dismay arose from the influential congressional Presbyterian camp because now you've got all these different religious Presbyterians and Methodists is trying to come in, and they're like, wait a minute, you can't start an Anglican church. What about the Presbyterian? What about this? And so you get all this because these are all these different kind of people, and then you get those that say we just don't want a state church. We just don't want an established church. So that brought much agitation. There's always that for some reason people are fighting against that. That that just brought in something that people are just no, 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 no. Thus, it may be seen that disestablishment was almost a foregone conclusion in the United States. No, they did not want um, an established church. With the founding of the new nation, one after another, the edifice of state church establishment toppled. With this new nation, they did not uh, establish, they did not have an established church. That's all that means. So that movement of disestablishment, meaning you don't want an established church, and they fought against that. And we see that. Um, there were some in some places there were continued church establishment in New England. New England kind of, at one point it was because of who was there in New England. It said New England, that says it all right there. Because these are people that New England, just like we saw New York was the Dutch. When we see New England, we see the English, and the English are trying to hold on to some things. And of course, in that part they're settling in, they try to hold on and have this established a church or religion, this established church. I should say it like that. So um, we get uh, the colonial legislators saw to the fact that the wait, provision for a church and a home for minister to each new town. They really wanted a bishop. They really want, like, when you go to Italy, when you go to Rome, there's a pope there. We would have had it if this would have happened. We would have at least had a bishop over us, some sort of something over us, over, I say us because we are Americans, over us, over this nation, that would have been in the laws and so forth. But we are a country that is separated from church and state. The church and state is separated. Um, the churches and the revolution. Remember, we talked about the American Revolution, where people, uh, immigrants, and whoever is settling in this country now have been here for a while, and they're like, no, we don't have to answer to England. So there's a separation or breaking away from England. Again, the Anglican Church was divided because was the Church of England. But what we see is some people did leave out of the Anglican Church to fight in the American Revolution. But again, it did affect the revolution. The American Revolution did affect how we worship, because um, we have the Baptists supported the revolution. The Presbyterians were generally patriot. Um, they struggled with it also, and we said the Methodists were suspect because I think at first Wesley coming out of England, how do you support something that's going to be a war against England when this people that have come, these immigrants have come from that era. Still, you still got kinfolks in England. How do you support a war? It means you're going to be fighting against one another, and you'll be fighting against some of the same things that you believe. But again, we see that, and we said that we're not going to get too detailed in it. I'm not, but I would advise you to go back and really read it and really find out what went on. And so by the time we have the American Revolution, everybody, all the religions are getting involved. People are getting involved. They're taking sides, and we end up we're fighting for the country, and it brings people together. So, but still, it separates some also, um, because they believe that it's in your literature. You can read it. They believe about the third paragraph. They believe that British victory would bring new political controls and a new religion, tightening, um, tightening, accompanied by the installation of an Anglican bishop in America. So I wish I could talk more on this, but this is the whole thing of people. They believe that if the British won, if the British got control, if England got control, then we would have England's religion, we would have political controls, we would have tightening on where you could go and what you could do. And now these people have been here long enough that if they wanted to go to California, they could, which I don't know, if they were doing that then. But wherever you wanted to go, you could go. But if you got uh, the England over you, you might not be able to have that freedom that you have fought so hard, and you come to the country in the first place for freedom, freedom of worship, freedom of religion, freedom to do and go. And so we see that. What else? The Great Awakening. Let's see if we covered that. The Great Awakening. Um, One of the major events of American Christianity during the 18th century was the Great Awakening. Um, with the loss of evangelical enthusiasm that characterized the first generation of Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and others, and with the increase of the unchurched on the expanding frontiers, religion and morals declined all over the colonies. So we, at one point, it was like everybody was doing their own thing. I mean, there was no religion. That's why when you see some of the old movies where you see a church trying to rise up in the western frontier, the church trying to come up, that's what it was, because it was wild, wild west. And so you get away from it, and the same with us. And the more we get away from church worship, we're not there in the building. We're we're not there around. We fail to assemble ourselves with others. The more we'll get out there, I'm afraid of that, because the Bible tells us don't neglect, don't fail to assemble ourselves with others, with other Christians. And I don't know if this, I call it pseudo worship, because most of us are worshiping on either somewhere on the computer or YouTube or Facebook, somewhere like that, our Sunday morning worship. And that's about all we get, is that one Sunday morning worship. And unfortunately, in this pseudo type of worship, we can go from church to church. And I'm afraid that it will just take us, we'll be out there like the Wild Wild West. Everybody will kind of be on their own, you know. So that's what happens when you get away from an established way of doing things. Okay. But then we have the Great Awakening, and the Great Awakening, it kind of brings some of the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists. Um, um, at the time, these were the largest Protestant denominations, but they begin to really try to, well, there is something, I believe that this is a God thing because it's a great awakening. It causes people to look around. We see the unchurched. I didn't know they had unchurched. We're talking about unchurched now, but that was the unchurched then. This unchurched. We always talk about the unchurched generation. That's the generation um, that we just lost our children, and we have a generation that comes up that just doesn't know the Lord, and that's what we have here. So we have this unchurched generation, but there's a great awakening, perhaps, and this is the first great awakening. Perhaps we will have a great awakening. We will have something like that. People talk about we're looking for a revival, but perhaps we need a great awakening, and that um, the preaching began to spread somehow with the increase of the unchurched on the expanding frontiers. Religion and morals declined all over the colonies. We know that because we know what happened even in the gold rush era. I mean, men did what they wanted to do. We saw that, and that's how it was in the early days of this country. But and I'm just paraphrasing here. Revival fires were burning, and so we see that among the Dutch, the Presbyterians, the Baptists. We see these revival fires and preaching of Jonathan Edwards. There's some names that you should know if you ever think about majoring in church history. Those are some names that you would want to know. I'm not going to go all into that because we'd never get through this. But you have Whitefield, you have John Wesley. These are ones that brought about revivals and preaching and this stirred up people because they went out to where the frontier people were. They went out to where the enslaved were, you know. And so we see this awakening spread to the Presbyterians in Virginia through the work of Samuel Morris and Samuel Davies, and to the Baptists through the work of Shubal Stearns and Daniel Marshall. We see all that because these Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Methodists from each of these churches, these Protestant churches, revival has broken out. And we see them reaching out, going out um, to the unchurched. It was a time in America when our churches, and I live in a neighborhood like that where the churches are in the neighborhood. You never know the church is in there, but that church is built into that neighborhood. You'll see that. And, but now the churches, those same churches that were built into the neighborhood, now we see a new people moving around those churches, living around those churches, and those churches have become other denominations, you know. And so we see that because that's what happened. Change comes. Change, change is good. Change is good. It doesn't. It always. People are afraid of change, but um, we see that um, there was uh, there was much preaching. We see a holiness uh, of God, the sinfulness. People began to call out sin, men, the righteousness of Christ, and we see all that. That's because of the preaching, the Great Awakening. And so, what was the results of the Great Awakening? The results of the Great Awakening. Here it is, right here. The results of the Great Awakening. Wow. The Great Awakening. The Great Awakening. I'm just going to go through that. The results of the Great Awakening. First, let me see. Results of the Great Awakening. Careful study of church records of New England will show that earlier estimates that at least 10% of the population of the era was converted in the awakening are probably correct. Thousands were swept into the kingdoms in the middle and southern colonies. Baptists in Virginia alone reaped a harvest of, a lot of people became Baptists. Amen. A lot of people became Baptists. Amen. How about that? How about that? Results of the Great Awakening, widespread conversion, stirring of missionary interest, founded, and if you're looking at page number, that's on about page 131, 132, 132. Results of the Great Awakening, widespread conversion, stirring of missionary interest, founding of evangelical colleges. We already talked about that. We've seen this. Conversion, missionaries going out, founding of evangelical colleges. We know that those colleges were religious schools, Yale and Harvard. And there were other schools that I'm just not going to mention here, but we know that there were other schools that are still today founded by religious orders. Divisions in congregational and Presbyterian churches. We have the congregational churches, Presbyterian churches. They are almost alike, but there's a division here because the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists in England, they're now different when they get here in America. When they get here in America, there's a difference. Rise to prominence of Jonathan Edwards. Somehow God is raising up this great preacher, Jonathan Edwards. Say what you will, but this is what we see. The rise of religious liberty. Divisions, we see the divisions and so forth. Wow. I mean, come on. So on the eve of the revolution, a revival broke out in the South under the leadership of Methodists, especially through the work of John King. So I'm going to let you read that, but be familiar. Again, this is for the sincere or scholar, is that you might want to know who some of these great early preachers were. And I can tell you that around this time, we had some great preachers in the Black or in the enslaved community. We had some great preachers there. And so we see that. Okay. So now let's look at the results. The results, it says, were phenomenal. The results on page 133. The results were phenomenal. First, a careful study of the church records of New England will show that earlier estimates that at least 10% of the population of the area was converted. We saw that. There was a quickening along with missionary and educational lines. We saw that. The schools. The revival contributed to the rise of religious liberty. That's on page 133. So we have this little chart. What we have here is that the author broke it down for us right here. Okay, he broke it down for us. Okay, right there. And then we come over here, right here. See where it says the results were phenomenal? Because all it does is give you what it just gave you on that little outline here, right here, right here. So when the author comes down, by the time the author gets here, he's saying the results were phenomenal. First, careful study of the church records of New England will show that earlier estimates of at least 10% of the population of the era was converted. So we saw that in our little chart, widespread conversion. Okay, so I won't go over that so that you, as long as you understand that. Second, here's that second thing on the chart, a quickening along the missionary. We saw that, the missionary interest. We saw that. So all that's happening here is the author is breaking it down for you. The revival, he's breaking that down to you. Third, fourth, the divisive or division among the Congregationists and the Presbyterians. There was something happening there. That's the reason we don't have an established church. We would have either had the Presbyterians as established church or the Congregationists, or maybe the Catholics. Catholics were just not that strong in this area, in this region or this part of the world. But they were in Spain, they were in Rome, they were in a lot of parts. Wherever they went, we saw Roman Catholic religion established. Even in this early days, we saw it in the, we still have some missions here. If you look around you and you ever go on, look around and visit some of our missions from the early days, our Santa Barbara, San Clemente, all of these missions are all over California at least. Spain established that. Spain established those missions. Different Father Sarah and all of them. They did it for the Indians to try and convert the Indians, and those missions are Catholic, and they established that. But we have that, and you can still visit some if you've ever visited those missions. We have one that's close to us in Orange County, San Bernardino. They're all spread out all along the coast. So if you get a chance, visit some of those missions. After all, it's part of church history also. It's where we see that Roman church or that Catholic church bringing with it, establishing some things, and really people. That's why we have a lot of those people that are Catholic into Mexico and into along the Indians and so forth. So we have that. Anyway, so we're going to move on. Let's look at religious decline. Briefly, just look at that. The Revolutionary War was hard on life in America. You see that? Hard on life in America. Because the churches so generally supported the revolution, the British took out their spite on houses of worship. Because the churches or the people, the church people really supported the revolution to say, we have to fight. We do not want to be part of England. And so the British, when they invaded, when the British came, and all some were already here, but when the British, they took out their spite on houses of worship, and they usually took them over to camp in them or live in them, or that was their headquarters, and sometimes they just got burned down. So we got that, and I'm trying to speed through this. But I want you to read that where it says conditions were so bad. Conditions were so bad. So look at that. Look at that. And I want you to read that just for your interest. Point out some things. This is talking about, this is the end of the 18th century here. Conditions were so bad during the years when the Constitution was being written and the new nation was being launched that politicians and ministers alike virtually gave up hope, because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know whether we're going to go back to England. England is going to take it, or whether we're going to have a new nation. And if we have a new nation, what does that mean? What does that mean? How do we do that? So it was, it says, dark indeed were the closing years of the 18th century. You see that? Dark indeed were the closing years of the 18th century. Imagine yourself there. Imagine yourself there. I had an instructor ask me one time, I was sitting in a political science class, and he said to the students, and we were right in the middle of the Civil War, and he said, imagine yourself there. What do you see yourself? And the different ones were saying, because I was mostly in a white class, different ones were saying this and saying that. When it got to me, I said, I imagine myself, I would be a slave. And he put his hand to his mouth and he said, oh my. Yes, because if I were there in that time of the American Revolution, Civil War, all of that, I would only imagine myself as a slave. But I know that I would be part of this great revolution because everybody in America was part of it, slave or free or whatever. You knew that you had to do something quickly. 19th century. In the 19th century, we're going to turn quickly to that, see if we can skip through it a little bit. 19th century brings in what? 19th century. Revival, social concerns, and liberalism. We come into the revival movements. We come into, it gives us a little breakdown here. It says 19th century, we come into the second evangelical awakening, Finney Revivals, that was another preacher. Revival of 1858, evangelistic work of Dwight L. Moody. And we hear that name, Dwight L. Moody, because that school, that institute that was founded is still there. Okay. So this is 27, chapter 27, revival, social concerns, and liberalism. We're in the 19th century now. And quickly to go over it, a lot of things were happening. The revival movements, the restoration movements. This is a second evangelical awakening. It says help was on the way. A few local revivals broke out in the early 1790s, but nothing extensive came until after the concert of prayer was launched. Somebody had a prayer meeting. Something happened in this, and I'm not just going to read it word for word because we take too long. But it says revival fires. You see that second paragraph? Revival fires burn over the entire nation. You see that? First in the East, especially in Connecticut and Massachusetts. See that? And in New England, the revival was quiet, but it was a revival nonetheless. And we see it in all parts, just breaking it out. People are really in this because of the pastors. It was, for the most part, services were carried on by the pastors in their respective churches. So it wasn't like that. It was just somebody going through the place, but revival was taking place quietly in these churches. Okay. So then we get down to where we're going now. We're going to, okay, revival. Just trying to give me a minute. Trying to in New England. Okay. All right. Let's go down to the effects. We talk about one of the greatest of these camp meetings. There were camp meetings. People talk about camp meetings. This camp meeting, one of the greatest camp meetings at that time, took place at Cane Ridge, Kentucky, where it was said that 25,000 gathered in August. Many as 5 preachers addressed the crowd simultaneously in different places on the ground. As elsewhere, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists cooperated in the venture. Reportedly, the character of Kentucky and Tennessee was completely changed by these meetings. The character of Kentucky and Tennessee were completely changed by these meetings. So if you can, would you read those, the effects of the second evangelical awakening? You might want to read that in case, if I said, what page are the second awakening? We already talked about the first awakening. Now we're talking about the second awakening. What were the effects of the second evangelical awakening? You see that, and I don't know if we have time. I don't have time to really go over that. I'm going to take all of your time, but I want you to read that, the effects of the second evangelical or awakening. Okay, make sure you take a look at the Finney revivals. As a second evangelical awakening began to lose some of its force, Charles Finney came on the scene. I believe that somehow, I know that these are men, but I think that God will always raise up somebody. He will always raise up someone that will stand for the truth, the word of God, and try and get people converted and recognize sin and remember that Christ died for us. So we see that in Finney. There's a revival of 1858. Kind of know that, read a little bit about it, highlight it just for to know about it. Also take a look at Moody. Moody's evangelical efforts. But you know, the school that was established during his time is still with us. Okay. He had remarkable success in this country. But you know, we know that a lot of these people came out of England. God used him. And then one of the things that our author does put in here for us is the slavery issue, because there is a slavery issue. What brings that about? The Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, all of a sudden, some people begin to see, and we call them abolitionists, they begin to see that, wait a minute, I think this is wrong. That if Christ died for everyone, these are people, because the whole thing is, in the first place, is that you can have slavery as long as you believe and think that these people are property. They're just chattel. They're not really human. But somehow in the Great Awakenings, we've had two now. We've had two. And this Great Awakening brings about some things, some thought that said, wait a minute. Widespread anti-slavery sentiment found expression in the formation of numerous anti-slavery societies, anti-slavery societies in the latter years of the 18th century and the early years of the 19th century. So things are moving into place here. So we see this, and I'm not going to dwell on it too much because we'll talk about it in class. But there's about 1830, the author tells us, we see that right about here. We see that a new phase of anti-slavery movement. We always, even back in the 1600s, there was an anti-slavery feeling that this is not right. But you know what? It just didn't get. I think the first movement, anti-slavery movement, would have been in the about 1688, somewhere like that. And so here we have it again. By the time the full effects of Eli Whitney's cotton gin were being felt, and the demand for cotton fast on the plantation, that's something I want you to study. That Eli Whitney's that gin. We studied it in school, the cotton gin. What did that do for slavery? I remember that one. And and maybe we can talk about it. What did that cotton gin do for slavery? Because one of the things that kept us bound to the earth was cotton. And when you're just not picking cotton, you've got to separate the what do you call it? The cotton from the little seed, the little thing that's holding it. Now the gin is doing that. So you can let your slaves go. You don't need the slaves like you needed them before the cotton gin was invented. Okay? But what about that? We really need to study that just to see what God has done for us. Not only for us, but I think He's doing it for people to cause them to free their souls, okay? So we talk about the abolitionists. We'll see that, and that has a lot to do with the Great Awakening, with the evangelism that was taking place, with the preaching that was going on, with the movement in the land, the attitude of the people towards slavery, and then the fact that some of these people were already, they had left their homeland because of persecution. And so you come here, and would you persecute someone else? You left England because you couldn't worship and you couldn't do like you wanted to do because of persecution, political and otherwise. And so, anyway, take a look at that. Again, this is the 19th century. There are many things that are going on in the 19th century. We said that the automobile and the light bulb, and oh my goodness, so many things came about when we look at it, if we ever looked at it in the 19th century. By the 20th century, everything really had been invented, you know. So we'll take a look at that. I guess that's not part of history, but that's another thought, you know. But here is the church in America, and we are done with that now. But take a look at it anyway, just in case some things might be on your exam. And then, of course, maybe it won't be on your exam, but you know, you do it for your own education, for your own self, if you have a chance to look at that. There are other things here that we just don't have time to talk about. But next thing that we want to talk about on Tuesday, which is November, I believe, will be November, would be the church in the contemporary world. So be prepared for us to talk about that a little bit. We'll just jump through it, and then we're going to try to go on into Black history, and we'll be done with that. Black history, I will give you your final exam. I'll give it to you way before it's due, and then you'll have plenty of time to get it back. This one will be a written one. I will give alternatives to the written exam. There may be alternatives to the written exam. I can't promise it right now. And I say that because there may be some things that I will be busy with and I won't have time to do the written exam. But I think that we've been so thorough in trying to go through this. You have been excellent students. You presented very well. So I may have you present some things on Black history to see where you are with that, see if you have gotten a really good understanding of church history. Church history, our family tree, it starts in the book of Acts, but we also see it in the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are those letters that Paul writes to Timothy and Titus, because he says a church is not just a church. I'm just paraphrasing, because it has a steeple, a praise team, it has a pulpit, it has choir loft, it has pews. That doesn't make a church. That's what Paul is saying to Titus, Timothy and Titus. But he also says that the church should have an organization, officers, it should have that leadership. But he's also saying that the church is Jesus Christ and he must be preached. Jesus Christ must be preached. The other thing that he is saying is that we must know that everything we do in the church should be according to the will of God. To the will of God, that's how we are to run the church. To the will of God. It's his church. And then he also says that what good is how beautiful, how big the church is, how many people are in the church, if the doctrine is not right. If the doctrine is not right. And we've come far enough now that we can look back and see some of the doctrine that was brought in, some of the false philosophy and thoughts. But if the doctrine is not right, and the man of God or the woman of God that is bringing in the doctrine, that's doing the preaching or the living, the holiness, if that's not right, you don't have a church. You don't have a church. And then this, again, Paul is saying, I am what I am because of Jesus Christ. So he's trying to tell Timothy and Titus what the church is really all about. Yes, we need the history of the church, but we also get the fact that God says, my church is my church. Christ died for the church. He is the church, the body. He is the body. Okay? The body of the church. He is the one that holds the body. Amen? And so if we're not doing that, we don't really have church. So read the pastoral epistles when you can, or if you ever thinking about, I'm going to be a pastor someday. I'm going to be a leader someday. You need to read the pastoral epistles. God bless you. Have a good one.